Today, we're moving on. This won't be on this test. It will be on the final. Everything from here on is on the final. And so today we're talking about the end of the era of good feelings and the beginning of basically the Democratic Party, actually. The Democratic Party started with Andrew Jackson. And it is so named because of its more democratic leanings, as in demos, the people, or as a lot of people at the time would call them, the mob. Now, we won't be talking about his Indian-related policies, because we will have an entire lecture on that next time. But keep that in mind, that there's going to be kind of a gaping hole. So, this is the United States in 1839 when Andrew Jackson became president, and you'll notice that, one, there's the lines in terms of where Mexico is have solidified, and also there is kind of all this extra territory over in the northwest than what we have today. And that's because the entire Oregon Territory, all the way up to what was then Russian Alaska, is jointly controlled by the U.S. And it's basically just unorganized open territory. Though this little part right here, what we would call Oklahoma today, would eventually become Indian territory. In fact, for a little bit, almost all of this area from the green parts all the way through the blue parts would be called Indian territory, because of what will happen in next on Thursday. So, Andrew Jackson really defines this era, and he had quite a story, as he keeps on coming up in the story of the United States, as we've seen. So, even when he was a little kid in the South, he was basically a Southern good old boy, and horsing around. But when he was underage, he actually ended up fighting with the Patriots during the American Revolution. But only after he had lost his brother to that war. In 1779, his brother died of heat exhaustion during the Battle of Stono Ferry. And in 1781, he was actually captured. Though he was underage, he was kind of pubescent, shall we say, to his captor, and his captor smacked him with a sword, with the broadside of a sword. So, he was pretty familiar with this kind of with fighting and all that kind of stuff, but he really wouldn't make his name until 1812. But before that, he speculated in land in Tennessee and became a slave owner on a plantation. So he had a very southern upbringing. And then, of course, we talked about his time in the War of 1812 in that lecture, and he won the Battle of New Orleans, which saved all that extra land that we had over in the Louisiana Purchase. But he was also known for engaging in lots of duels. Here's a fly around here. Quite a violent man, and he was quick to be offended. So he's known to have engaged in at least 5 duels, but those are just the ones that are known because they were printed in papers and made a big deal. He might have actually engaged in as many as 100 duels. In 1806, he killed a man simply because he printed a story about his wife. And well, he was not prosecuted for that because in the South, dueling, even though it was against the law, was considered okay. Just a couple years prior, remember, there was the whole duel between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. And that was, at the top level of government. But they were in the South, and so that's just what you do. Well, they were in New Jersey, but well, if you attend the next half of this, you'll find out New Jersey tends to be kind of its own southern state. But he also ended up fighting a number of Indian wars, which will, of course, inform his Indian policy. Of course, there's the Creek War during the War of 1812. But also there was the First Seminole War in 1818 that he basically invaded Florida and then took it for the United States. So this is a man who is used to violence, but also kind of a popular figure because, well, he keeps on beating the Indians, beating the British, beating his opponents in duels. And of course, he did try to run in 1824 for president by forming his own party, but failed. So the new guy who was John Quincy Adams, the son of the previous Adams, ended up passing what is known as the Tariff of Abominations in 1828, and that basically secured Jackson his election. So he has all of this kind of success, and right at the top of it, he gets elected in November, and 1 month later, his wife dies. And remember, he literally fought a duel over her honor, so losing her was quite a blow. But when he was elected, he came in with a pretty solid vote. And he was elected, which you can see pictured here when he was inaugurated, he basically had a party at the White House. And it was so bad that that they ended up trashing the place. You could see here frickin' Jackson looking like he doesn't want to be there. He actually ended up escaping out a window during all the festivities. But, probably not a good idea to invite in the basically your entire electorate, and ply them with liquor. So this is kind of the tone of his entire presidency. He'll do very popular things. Another word for this kind of politics is populism. Something we could even call the current president is a populist. Another thing that really reinforced all of this was the end of property requirements for voting. In 1789, when the U.S. Started our new Constitution, only 6% of people were qualified to vote. And that's actually when most states still didn't actually bar black people from voting, but they did have to have property to vote. Eventually, black people lost the vote, but very quickly, more people gained the vote by states losing the property requirements, starting with Kentucky in 1792, and not ending until North Carolina in 1856. So Virginia and North Carolina, and actually Rhode Island, still had property requirements, but everywhere else did not. Basically, it was universal suffrage for white males. Women also technically had the vote under the property requirements, but as they enfranchised non-property owners, they took away the ability of women to vote as well. So there's kind of a trade-off here when it comes to democracy, that they are allowing a lot more people to vote, but women and basically widows, because women weren't allowed to have property if their men had property, that it was technically their husband's property until he died. But if he had died, then she had property and she'd be able to vote. So when they took away the property requirements, that qualification for black freemen, obviously slaves didn't own property, but black people and women suddenly could not vote anymore because they were disenfranchised by this enfranchisement. But that being said, most white males could vote now. It was basically universal. And that's part of what brought Jackson to power, is the fact that there were so many more people voting. And they were the underclasses, the demos, the mob. So we already talked about when he was inaugurated, they basically trashed the White House. And as one of the Supreme Court justices who was there said, the reign of King Mob seemed triumphant. So you can see, he's this populist. He seems like he's letting the rabble take over. Despite the fact that, he's an aristocratic Southerner who owns quite a few slaves and, is quite rich and would have qualified to vote no matter what anyways. But same thing with our current president, right? There's quite a following in terms of his popular appeal, and yet he's quite rich and separated them by experience. There's a lot of commonality between our current president and this one. Part of kind of democratizing the government is that he started a new system called the spoils system. And this is basically he would appoint people who were loyal to him. Before this, most presidents were appointing people basically because they were qualified. But he reformed the entire system so that it was all about patronage. This spoils system would last well into the 19th century, and basically its end would start the beginning of the progressive era in the 1890s. But it was very much a system that will stick all the way through the rest of this class. So from then on, political appointments were absolutely just that, political. You get a new president, he fires all the appointees from the previous president, and then replaces them with people loyal to him. This was basically a way of awarding loyalty. For instance, he actually fired 423 postmasters just in 1829 when he was inaugurated. So think about that. Postmasters are just, the guy who's responsible for delivering mail locally. He is mostly just a local guy who happens to have enough free time to do that. But it does get you some sort of pay, and therefore it was a really easy way to give somebody some sort of patronage. Give them a steady wage to deliver the mail. So from then on, basically all appointments, even something as small as a post office official, they were part of the spoils system. He also, because of all of this, it was not exactly popular, right? Just firing 423 postmasters, which, by the way, that's basically the only time that most Americans would even see a federal official of any sort, was only with the mail. Most of the rest of this stuff is done through proxies or through the states. Even elections, well, heck, elections today are not federally administered, they're administered by the states, right? So most stuff is delegated down to the states, except for the mail. And so firing that many people all at once was not exactly popular. And there was just constant scandals in any number of ways. What really started getting a lot of news on him, and mind you, things like the post office were literally founded in order to spread news. So a lot of Americans were very much literate and reading the papers to see what was happening. So his entire presidency basically became the soap opera for everyone to watch. And what really climaxed this whole thing was the Petticoat Affair. He appointed John Eaton to be Secretary of War. And the thing about I have. Is that a mosquito? Ugh. The thing about John Eaton was that he was just scandal-ridden himself. He was known to have had a few affairs, and that made his wife kind of seen as, scandalous to befriend. And so the wives of all of Jackson's cabinet ended up really hating her, and this formed quite a rift. And having seen all that stuff with Jackson's own wife, after all, she had epilepsy, and that's actually what killed her. Was a seizure, but that is what had made her particularly why people would attack her in the press and that. And so, having experienced that with his own wife, he ended up siding with Peggy Eaton. And ended up, this all came to a head in 1830 when it made the national news. Of course, the papers are just running with it because, now national politics depend on the inner squabbles of a bunch of wives, hence why it's called the Petticoat Affair. And so by 1831, Jackson had had enough, and he ended up firing his entire cabinet and reformulating it, with one exception, the Postmaster General, who he had elevated to the cabinet for the first time in 1829. He also basically ostracized his vice president, who was John C. Calhoun, and this would come to bite him pretty quickly. And instead, he started favoring basically the person who would be the Northerner, who is the co-founder of the Democratic Party, Martin Van Buren. And when Jackson was reelected, Martin Van Buren would officially become his vice president. But you can see this Petticoat Affair ends up actually having quite a huge effect. It recenters the Democratic Party, because John C. Calhoun was a Southerner, but Calhoun was alienated by this whole affair, and now Martin Van Buren is the co-founder of the Democratic Party, and he's a Northerner. So it was looking like the Democrats would end up being a very sectional party, but they weren't because of this. Although Jackson was very pro-slavery, and during his administration, abolitionists really came to the fore, and he'd end up really trying to fight against them. For instance, they started a letter-writing campaign in the 1834, and he tried to actually have the mail censored to stop that. Didn't go so well for him in Congress, so instead he just asked his stricken postmaster generals to burn all the letters themselves. And they did so. Completely illegal, but what are you going to do? He also really opposed that American system that we talked about with the during the era of good feelings, which wanted high tariffs to pay for infrastructure and a central banking system. And this was essentially, his opposition was so that he could shrink the size of the government. Jackson was very much against big government. You know, you have more tariffs, then you can pay for more infrastructure, but that also means you need to have an entire branch of the government devoted to that. Now, he wasn't against infrastructure so much as tariffs. He just really didn't want tariffs, and ended up passing a smaller tariff. And as part of all this, he really started using the veto power of the president. So prior to this, presidents who used the veto would use it like once or twice in their entire administration. And that's exactly the number that George Washington used in both of his terms, 2 vetoes. But Jackson started using it as a political cudgel. Basically, he wouldn't let bills pass unless he got his way. Sound familiar? Most of these were for subsidies. So subsidizing the banks, subsidizing roads, that kind of stuff. He actually only ended up vetoing 12 bills, but that was more than any other president prior. And so it was quite scandalous at the time. And we'll talk about it next time, but he also was very much about trying to get more land for folks who could, for westward expansion. And that meant removing the Indians who were there. Indian removal was a concrete policy by the 1830s. But we'll be talking about that next lecture. He also really wanted Texas, because during his time, Texas had their revolution, and he immediately recognized Texas in 1836. They declared independence in 1836, and it's something like 3 months later, he officially recognized them as a country. He actually believed that that Texas was American territory because of the Louisiana Purchase. Remember that whole thing? So he was perfectly fine with Texas having their revolution and recognizing them because he thought that it was technically American territory anyways. In 1838, the U.S. Army formed the Topographical Corps of Engineers, which ended up sending out a lot of expeditions to basically map out all the new territories. And in that same year, the exploring expedition set out to basically explore the world's oceans, especially the Pacific. And they ended up kind of making concrete claims on Oregon as part of this, but they ended up all over the place, getting in fights on numerous islands. It was kind of a whole bungled affair, but you know, it was organized under the Jackson administration, so of course it was you know, going to be pretty violent and scandal-ridden. And eventually the Topographical Corps of Engineers would end up trying to map Mexican territory in the 1840s, which they'd send people down there, especially John C. Fremont, who'd end up basically causing another revolution to start in California. So you could see kind of how he operates, right? He's doesn't really care if anybody gets in his way. He's very violent. He is quite popular because of all of it, and he wants to give back to the people who elected him. So can you guess who his biggest enemy would be then? If he's quite the populist, what's the opposite of a populist?
An elitist.
An elitist. And who were the most elite American citizens?
Democratic Republicans.
Well, his party was formed as a split from them, so Republicans were basically the only party at the time, and then Jackson came around. Remember last lecture that we were talking about conspiracism? What was one of the things that people kept on having conspiracy theories about? That was awfully elitist.
Masons.
True, though Jackson was one, so not exactly going to be opposed to his own fraternity. Banks. Remember, there was a centralized bank. So, from 1891 to 1811, there was the First National Bank. They were only chartered for 20 years, and so in 1811 they were dechartered and bought by an individual who ended up saving the U.S. during the War of 1812 through his own personal loans. Obviously, he made a lot of money from doing that, so, not exactly altruistic of him. But seeing that there was a second national bank chartered in 1816, and once again for 20 years. But 1816 is awfully close to 1819, which is when a panic came in, and so people thought that basically the Second National Bank had caused the panic, and people who basically thought that it was so that they could make money, right? It was a whole conspiracy theory. And Andrew Jackson was absolutely a conspiracy theorist. Notice more and more parallels between him and the current president, right? So Andrew Jackson ended up really butting heads with the bank. But in fact, when he came to power, he actually praised Nicholas Biddle, who was the person in charge of the National Bank. But at the same time, he denounced the National Bank as being unconstitutional in that same address. So he started off kind of ambivalent about it, but steadily became more and more anti-bank. The National Bank would end up requiring a rechartering in 1836, and that's when all of this came to a head. What would become the Whigs formed basically because of all of this. So there was the Anti-Jackson Party, which formed in 1824. Well, it's debatable when it actually formed. They were basically just the anti-Jackson wing of the Democratic Republicans. So John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay were the head of this, and would eventually turn into the Whigs. But the argument over rechartering this got so indignant that Jackson started saying that he would veto any recharter effort of the National Bank. Because remember, he said that it was unconstitutional, and he honestly thought that the National Bank had conspired in 1819 to cause a great deal of misery so that they could profit from it. And before the election in 1832, when Jackson was reelected, that's when he officially vetoed the rechartering. And the recharter was actually basically designed to force his hand because he kept on talking about vetoing it, and it was perfectly in time for the election, right? Just a few months beforehand, he vetoes the charter, and now it's national news. And so in 1832, Henry Clay actually ran against Jackson, and Biddle openly supported the anti-Jacksonians. Bad move on his part, because they still lost. Remember that whole rise of conspiracism in the U.S. electorate, and Jackson played into that, and so he won re-election in 1832. So now it looks like the bank will dissolve by 1836 and end up going into private hands. But Jackson wants it to dissolve quicker than that. So in 1833, when he was technically had been re-inaugurated, he started refusing to send federal deposits to the National Bank. And he started replacing the Secretary of the Treasury, specifically because the Treasury secretaries knew that this was actually a really bad idea. He went through 3 until finally landing on Roger Taney, who was only there as an interim Treasury Secretary, specifically to remove deposits in the National Bank. And he started moving the federal deposits to other banks, especially state banks, and especially states that were loyal to him. So even though you'll hear a lot of people talking about him removing the national bank, all he really did was move it to the states. He decentralized it. Most states had their own banks. This also meant that there would be really no good monetary policy until the 1840s. At one point, there were more than 200 different legal tender circulating in the United States. Alexander Hamilton would have been flipping around in his grave, because that just causes chaos. And in fact, there would be a 7-year depression basically because of this. But almost perfectly right as Jackson leaves. So he gets to avoid the blame. But the National Bank was basically dissolved because of all this. It actually ended up getting rechartered under Pennsylvania as Pennsylvania's bank, with still Biddle having the reins, but Biddle really couldn't do anything other than raise interest during all of this, which in and of itself caused a small panic. So first you have this little tiny panic, and then the bank loses its charter and can't really influence anything besides in Pennsylvania. And then just a year after that, there was the Panic of 1837, also known as the Jackson Panic, for good reason. So with all of this stuff going on, you think that's enough scandal for the first Democratic president. But he also ended up, remember, he had alienated his vice president, thank you. And his vice president ended up becoming quite a thorn in his side. John C. Calhoun was from South Carolina, and South Carolina really didn't like even the lowered tariffs that he had passed. They wanted no tariff whatsoever. And so there had been this argument floating around since 1799, which Thomas Jefferson and James Madison had composed a series of arguments against the Alien and Sedition Acts back then, known as the Kentucky and Virginia Resolutions. Jefferson wrote the Virginia Resolutions, Madison wrote the Kentucky Resolution, saying basically that they could, that states didn't have to abide by national laws if they passed nullification. That states had a right to nullify unconstitutional laws. And they said that that was part of the guarantee of the 10th Amendment. But you know, as we saw with when Jefferson actually became president, he was willing to violate the Constitution himself quite readily, and expand the government more than anyone else, even though he argued that this 10th Amendment specifically forbade the expansion of the government. So South Carolina really didn't want that tariff, and in 1832, a minor reduction from the tariff of abominations was passed, but it still wasn't satisfactory to South Carolina. And so the South Carolinians thought that they could nullify the tariff. And they were led by John C. Calhoun. See how that whole petticoat affair ended up biting Jackson in the bud? So they passed the Ordinance of Nullification, which passed in November 24th of 1832, and just a couple of weeks later, Jackson responded sending out a proclamation to the people of South Carolina, basically saying he'd enforce the tariff with the military, that he would declare that he would declare South Carolina as being an insurrection, and using the Insurrection Act of 1804 to enforce it. This was furthered in March of that year with an act further to provide for the collection of duties on imports, which Jackson rammed through Congress, basically so that he could send troops without having to declare insurrection if South Carolina was to continue with this nullification. And of course, the South Carolina nullified the act, declared that the Force Act was nullified too. You can't declare war on us. We nullify that. So it looked like there was a civil war coming, right? But Jackson was actually pretty anti-tariff himself, and he managed to defuse the situation by passing a tariff in 1833 that would just steadily lower over the course of a few years. So it was basically a compromise to prevent a civil war. And but you can guess that didn't really make Jackson popular. You know, him being willing to start a civil war over tariffs is not exactly going to win you a lot of friends. Although one could argue that 30 years later probably would have been a lot easier if the president before Lincoln had been a little bit more decisive than like Jackson. But unfortunately, that's not how Buchanan worked. But because of all these scandals, scandals with the banks, scandals with the nullification crisis, scandals with the petticoat affair, just over and over and over, scandal, scandal, scandal. A new party system came to the fore specifically to oppose him. And so the Whigs formed to oppose him. Remember, there was already the anti-Jacksonian party. They essentially just became the Whigs. So you have the Democrats, who are symbolized by Jackson. And by the way, you know how the symbol of the Democratic Party is a donkey? Well, it was because Jackson was constantly labeled a jackass. So the symbol of the Democratic Party is not a donkey, it's a jackass. Jackson and Martin Van Buren are the figureheads of the Democratic Party, and John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, the great compromiser, formed the Whigs. But also John C. Calhoun, because of having been vice president and losing that position, and then having all of this nonsense in South Carolina, joined the new party. So you could see both parties are not sectional. They don't have a particular leaning in terms of north or south. They're more about, basically personal politics. Whether or not they like Jackson or not. There was also the anti-Masons who were still a party at this point, still very much informed by conspiracism and that. And the National Republicans were the first formulation of the Whigs, but through a merger of the National Republicans, which was the official anti-Jackson party, and the anti-Masons, that's what actually created the Whigs in 1834. So with all of this, we have a very clear party system. There's Democrats and Whigs. But the Democrats are very much the much more popular party, as their name might imply. And so when Jackson stepped down from his two-term thing, there aren't term limits at this point, but many presidents would choose to step down simply because in honoring what George Washington had done. In fact, there wouldn't be a president who would serve more than 2 terms until the 1930s. And then right after him, term limits were imposed constitutionally because of that. But Martin Van Buren, Jackson's vice president, became the next Democratic president. And he was elected in 1836. he ended up also supporting a lot of expansion during his presidency. For instance, there was several attempts with what were called hunters' lodges during a series of rebellions up in Canada, with Americans basically supporting the rebellions, possibly in hopes of annexing Canada. And there was a series of fights in 1838 through 39 known as the Aroostook War in Maine, basically over where the border of Maine would be. And he kept on pushing to have further borders. He wanted a more northerly border in Maine. He wanted to have the Oregon Territory to the United States, but ended up having to negotiate them anyways. But he only lasted one term and was defeated by the first Whig president, William Henry Harrison, who is our shortest-lived president to date, because he died just a few months after his inauguration. The old tale is that he caught pneumonia after giving too long of a speech during the inauguration. That doesn't really hold true, though. It's a little bit more complicated than that. But this brought in John Tyler, his vice president. Tyler would end up not really being popular. He was, first of all, very much a Southerner. In fact, he's our only traitorous president because he ended up joining the rebels during the Civil War. Literally, we had a president in the Confederate Congress. And John Tyler ended up splitting with his own party. And he, especially when he raised the tariff in 1842, known as the Black Tariff, Whigs wanted to distribute some of those funds to the states to improve infrastructure, but Tyler vetoed it. Tyler was one of the only presidents to actually be against infrastructural improvements. They wanted to fund railroads and canals and whatnot, and he didn't want that. He wanted to basically grow the coffers of the state banks. So the Whigs actually started impeaching him. His own party started to impeach him over all this. And this was the first time a presidential impeachment. This was the first time that the president started to get impeached, but it actually never made it through the House. But first time a president even gets impeached, and it's from his own party. In 1844, while he was on a cruise on the USS Princeton, a new naval ship, they were kind of showing off the new cannons and everything, and one of the cannons blew up and ended up killing a bunch of people, including some members of his cabinet, his Secretary of State, most importantly. So he had a lot of reason for people to dislike him, and on top of all of this, he started talking to Texas to try to annex them. They had been waffling back and forth about annexation for a while, but Tyler would solidify it during his thing, but not in time to win the election. And the election ended up going back to the Democrats with Polk, but we will leave that for a later lecture. So you can see with all of this stuff, this new party system is very much about like personal politics, rather than like, what the country is actually doing, right? And it's all brought on by Andrew Jackson. So let me flip this thing around real quick. Why do you think, what legacy is that? What does that mean for the United States moving forward, that politics suddenly has become very personal?
Like you said, it kind of changed the way people did politics. Like before, they were appointed, they would appoint cabinet members and judges and all that based on qualifications. And now it's more loyalty based, which we see that even nowadays.
Mm-hmm. I mean, especially with the spoil system, right?
Yeah.
Like, what does the spoil system do?
It kind of opens the door and saying like, oh, well, if you get me these votes and get me elected, it's a reward, or there's a reward for you later on.
Mm-hmm. So what does that reinforce?
Corruption?
Very much, yes. But it also reinforces something in terms of politics, right?
The party system, you have to be aligned with the party to get anywhere.
Yeah.
Whenever the president takes office, they fire everybody and bring people to their party.
Yeah, precisely. There's an entire system devoted to making sure that people are loyal. So politics is all about loyalty at this point, right? Which is kind of different from before. Remember, prior to Jackson, there was basically only one party. From 1815 to 1828, the Democratic Republicans were, completely in control. In fact, Monroe ended up running unopposed, remember? So this is a very different thing. No president will ever run unopposed again. And this kind of solidifies that, right? What other thing in terms of, like, what about now? Why does it matter now? Because obviously we don't have the spoil system anymore. That would be eliminated in 1886. But there's still this kind of lingering aftermath of that, of these personal politics. What is that? I drew a lot of allusions to Trump in the lecture, right? Why is that? Like,
Well, you kind of still see like the similarities that also referring to like Jackson being able to like veto anything that didn't really go his way.
Mhm.
Especially now, the president does veto a lot of things that don't really go his way, and even now you could see like sometimes his own party is against him and some of the choices that he makes.
yeah, definitely. There's, our current president was not very popular in his own party, right? You could see a lot of people who basically went from saying, he's the worst possible thing we could do to literally campaigning for him. Could see the same thing happening with Jackson, right? Then literally an opposition party forms to counteract him, even though he's not really a separate party until that happens. At this point, the parties would actually end up being calling themselves something different basically every single election. And so there wasn't any concern about like party loyalty or anything prior to Jackson because they just changed their name every time. You know, we use the term Jeffersonian Republican or Democratic Republican, but they went by all kinds of different names, election after election after election. It was basically just, the heck? It was basically just a group of like-minded politicians, right? But now you needed a name, and that name was formed around a president. But yeah, there's a lot of that kind of loyalty is necessary, but you can also see there's a lot of personal scandals, and quite similar to the current president. And this is kind of what he's playing off of, this populism, right? Remember we talked a while back where the rise of populism in terms of religion? Well, at the same time as all of this is happening, there's actually a second Great Awakening happening, which we will talk about in a different lecture. But remember, the first Great Awakening really brought a lot of populism to religion. Well, now it's coming to politics. So, what does that mean in terms of just, what does populism mean in terms of U.S. politics?
Fractionalism. Someone's always going to get kind of screwed over by the populism.
Definitely. Right? There's definitely going to, it furthers the factionalism that's already inherent in the party system, right? That now there's a new party system, even though the old party system had died away. Now it's purely about who's loyal to whom. You have the literal jackass party and the opposition party, but basically purely formed to oppose Jackson. So, but what else about like populism? Because we're also talking about like now there's more people who can vote, right? Like why is populism such a necessary thing for politicians?
Well, it's kind of like nowadays you have to more please the people than actually. Politics nowadays is around how good other people see you, rather than what you're gonna do later on in your election or during your term.
Say that last bit again.
Yeah. So like, it's more about how well you're liked rather than what you're actually gonna do later on.
Yeah, very much so, right? It's more about like the personality behind something rather than the actual rather than their actual policies.
Yeah.
It's about charisma. The Democrats, or the demos, the mob, is less concerned about like waffling around about banks and tariffs and all that kind of stuff. They're concerned about, whether or not they get a road, right? That's like their main concern, whether or not they have a functioning post office. Simple things like that. It's basically they don't really care about the federal government because it doesn't really have much of an effect on their lives. So now it's just about, what that whole thing about like whether or not you can get a drink with the guy. Okay, so let's talk about his actual veto. In that message, have you guys read it? All right, so in that he talks about how the banks control too much and they're unconstitutional. and all along those lines. So, remember we talked about conspiracism in the previous class? How does this, like, what does conspiracism do throughout all of this? How does it feed into populism?
Wasn't it that most of the population in the States at the time were like concerned with conspiracy theories and all that?
Mhm.
Especially during, like you said, Jackson was a big conspiracy theorist himself, and
Mhm.
throughout history he was known as like the president of the people or something like that.
Yeah, he's definitely known as that, but part of that is that, like, you know, as you said, it's conspiracism is a way of appealing, right? So, you know, some politicians might engage in conspiracism purely to feed their popular appeal, right? That's a recipe for disaster, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, we'll see that especially happen when the Republicans come to power and they start talking about what they call the slave power conspiracy. And, you know, they're not exactly wrong either. It's the weird thing. There really was kind of it's not a conspiracy, but there was definitely a political movement afoot at the time to spread slavery. You can see even during Jackson's time, his whole burning of pamphlets during the rise of abolitionism, that there's already kind of a movement to suppress abolition. That there's a pro-slavery movement, even more powerful than an anti-slavery movement. And what doesn't help matters is being a conspiracist about it, right? So we'll see conspiracism really drive up factionalism. Anything else about conspiracism and populism? All right, well, I have a good day.